Hey y'all, welcome back to Biblically Blonde. My name's Lacey, and in this video we're going to go over Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you want to know what happens, why it happens, what it tells us about God, and how we can apply it in our life, then keep watching. Alrighty y'all, like I said in the intro, we are going over Sodom and Gomorrah, which is Genesis 19. And it's the majority of Genesis 19. There's a little bit at the end there dealing with Lot and his daughters, which will be in the next video. But here we are going to be talking about what happens in there, why it happens, what it tells us about God, and how we can apply it in our daily life. Quickly, if you're new to my channel, my name's Lacey and I'm Biblically Blonde. Here we seek wholehearted living for Christian women, and we do that in a multitude of ways. I mainly choose to focus on Bible literacy by doing these Bible guides. I think that the Bible can be easily understood and we can grow closer to God if we just seek to know Him, and that's why I make these videos, to make it so we can understand scripture that might have been hard for us or scripture that we had questions on, and get a better understanding and grow closer to God through it. So Genesis 19, of course, is happening right after the events of Genesis 18. If we remember, in Genesis 18, there were 3 men that arrived upon Abraham, and Abraham invites them in, shows them hospitality, allows them to rest, and serves them a meal. We later find out that one of those men is God Himself, while the 2 others are divine angels. And so God informs Abraham of what is about to happen, and He promises him that if there are 10 righteous people in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, that He will spare all of the people living in this area. Now, quickly, before we go into what is actually happening in Genesis 19, let's understand a little bit of historical context. Sodom and Gomorrah are 2 separate cities, but they are living within a plains area. And so to get a general kind of idea, you're going to have mountain areas kind of surrounding this one flat land. And in this flat land, you have multiple towns. You're going to have Sodom, Gomorrah, and a few others. And so when God is going to come and show His judgment upon this area, it is to these towns of Sodom and Gomorrah and surrounding areas. It tells us in scripture that it's even their farmland that gets destroyed. So everything in this plains area is going to have judgment bestowed upon it. And so it's not just one city, it's multiple cities, but it's not a huge city like we think of today. These are more small little towns, and they all kind of mix together. They all trade together, share farmland together. You can easily access one of the other towns within a day. So it's not really long, strenuous to get from one to the other. They all intermix. So now that we understand how the town is set up, we can go on to Lot. Now, if we remember, Lot is Abraham's nephew, and when Abraham and him were traveling and going from place to place, living in these tent cities and being nomads, they got so rich in livestock and in people that they eventually had to separate because their 2 groups were fighting with one another. And Abraham gave Lot the choice of where to go, and Lot chose to go to the flat land where there is rivers and it was just more plentiful and easier to live, whereas Abraham got the more mountainous side of the plain where he was going to be picking up and moving every few years or every few months. And so we see from the beginning that Lot wants kind of an easier lifestyle. He wants to live in convenience most of the time. And so we see him multiple times in scripture get closer and closer to these cities. At first, he's maybe living a day and a half away or a few hours away. By the time we get to Genesis 19, he is right outside the city gates, meaning every single day he is going into the city of Sodom. His daughters are married into men of Sodom. His wife has intermixed herself into the gossip and the lives of the people of Sodom. So while he himself is still considered a Hebrew, he is the nephew of Abraham. He was not included in the covenant of circumcision because he was not with Abraham at that time, and he certainly is living more so like a citizen of Sodom than he is an Israelite or a Hebrew at that time. That all being said, Lot still is counted as righteous, and he still is trying to hold on to what little left of his righteousness and relationship with God that he has. And we can see that by the fact that he's waiting outside the gates of Sodom to welcome anyone in. It is very similar to Genesis 18 when Abraham comes and allows them to rest and to dine with him. And so Lot offers the same. He wants to offer his home to these visitors. He wants to offer a meal. The honor of hospitality was huge, especially to these Hebrew men. And so he wanted to keep that honor and bestow upon them great hospitality. It is then that they encounter the first signs of trouble here. The angels, which Lot at the time doesn't realize they're angels, but it will become apparent as the story goes on, basically go into Lot's home. After a few hours, maybe later in the evening, all the men, it tells us, all the men, young and old, of Sodom start banging on Lot's door, demanding that the men inside come out so they may know them sexually. They want to rape them. And so Lot says, no, please do not do this thing. You can have my 2 daughters instead who do not know men. They still think that that is not acceptable. They want the 2 men, the 2 visitors, the 2 angels, and they demand that they bring them out. And they tell Lot, because you have kept this from us, we will treat you worse than we will these 2 men. And so then it becomes apparent that these men are divine angels because they move Lot aside and they cast blindness upon those men so they cannot get to the door and bang the door down. And then the men appear to Lot and say, listen, this isn't going well. The outcry has been very loud to the Lord, and he has to bring his judgment upon these cities. Take who you can and get out. We cannot do anything until you are out. And so what we can see here is while God was not able to find 10 righteous people, he has decided that he will count Lot as righteous and is giving Lot the opportunity to escape the land of Sodom with his family and be able to start over and live a more righteous life. And so he goes to his brother-in-laws and his son-in-laws, I should say. He goes to his son-in-laws, they laugh at him and think that this is stupid, that this couldn't possibly be. And so then finally the angels come to him and say, we are doing this, get out. They grab them and they actually have to almost physically force them out of this land. They say, go into the mountainside. At that time, Lot is saying, no, I cannot survive in the mountainside. So instead asks that this small area of Zor, which is a smaller town, a little farther out, that they could escape there. And so they grant that, and they say, we will not touch the land of Zor. We will keep that safe so you, your daughters, and your wife can go and live there. But do not look back. Do not leave your hearts in Sodom. Keep going. And so while they are leaving, Lot's wife does look back, and she becomes a pillar of salt and apparently passes away. And so God then rings his justice upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities are destroyed, and not just the cities, but all of their farmland and anything that is associated with those cities in this plain land. And then early the next morning, Abraham goes out where he can look upon the area and sees that it has been destroyed. But if we dig deeper into the why, of course, we always want to know why. And typically when I ask the question why, it's more of why did the author write this? What was the historical context for this? Well, let's remember that Moses is the one who's writing Genesis, and he's writing it to the Israelites before they're about to go into the promised land, and he's setting them up here. So if we think on to later scripture like the book of Judges, like the book of Numbers and things like that, we're going to see where God is going to require of the Israelites to go to war and to destroy other people groups and have a lot of death upon these people. And so we're going to see this happen, and we're going to ask ourselves when we get there in that piece of scripture, why would God do this? Why is this something that is happening in scripture? Why is this God ordered, right? And so we are going to look back upon this story of Sodom and Gomorrah and see why, because this is the same area, the same land that this is going to happen in many, many years later with the Canaanites and the Israelites later on in the Promised Land. And so what we can see is that God does not rain down his justice unless the wickedness is so atrocious that there is no righteousness to be found. And so when we think of people, I like to think people are good. I like to think that you can always try to find the why. Hurt people hurt people. I always think that. And I always try to have mercy and look at the humanity of someone. And we have to remember that the people who were living in Sodom and Gomorrah did not possess that humanity. They did not possess an ounce of righteousness, an ounce of goodness, an ounce of moral compass. It didn't exist to these people, because our God is a good God, and we can prove that through scripture time and time again. And so for this to be the outcry, this to be what happens, which is an entire city being destroyed, we have to realize that it was for a reason, and it was because the wickedness was so extreme. There was no humanity, there was no moral compass, there was no goodness in any of these people. The only people who survived were Lot and his daughters. And one would argue, and we will later on, that the only reason that Lot's daughters were survived was because of Lot. Now, and you could even argue that Abraham's pray for Lot was why Lot was saved. And then we go down this rabbit hole that we don't want to go on, and it's complicated and you get confused. But that's the why. We want to set this up because when the Israelites are going to have to go to war with these Canaanite people, they are going to want to know why. And just like these Canaanite people have no humanity to them, no moral compass, no goodness, Sodom and Gomorrah is 1,000 times worse. God would not destroy a city for one reason or for 1,000 reasons. There's a lot of videos out there on why Sodom and Gomorrah happened, why this happened, all of these things. But what we know for sure is that there was wickedness in the land, and the outcry was atrocious. Now, I always say when you hear the word wicked in the Bible, it tells you two things. It tells you that there was sexual sin in the land, and it tells you that there's violence. And most of the time it tells you that there's sexual violence. So you can make of that what you'd like, but this was wicked. And so we can know that it was a multitude of things. There was violence in the land, there was murderers in the land, there was a whole lots of stuff going on that was not good to God. It wasn't one event that made God decide that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. This was years and years of outcry that finally led to this, where God finally showed his judgment after giving so much time for mercy. He even came down to make sure that there was not one good person in this land, and he could not find even 10 to show his mercy to. So then what does the story tell us about God? I've kind of answered that in the why, but let's dig a little deeper here in the story of Lot. So Lot by this time has fully immersed himself into this town, city living, especially in the city of Sodom. And yet in the New Testament, it tells us that Lot was righteous and that God actually saved Lot. He could have destroyed him in this city of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was marrying off his daughters to sons of Sodom. His wife was fully involved into the town of Sodom. He was involved. We'll see more of this in the next video over, I should say. But God saves him, and God saves him because God sees our heart. So while, yes, everything I said in the why part is true about how God does give justice, but let's also know that God sees our hearts and he wants to show mercy to us. And so we can know that for every bit of extreme that God is, he is 1,000 times more merciful. So then how can we apply this in our daily life? Well, I always ask myself, is our lingering ruining us? In scripture, it says that Lot lingered. He had to physically be grabbed by the angel and taken out of that land. And if it wasn't for the angel getting him out of there, his lingering would have destroyed him, because he would have lingered on and just kept there until he was ready. He was allowing himself to be corrupted by the worldliness of Sodom. And so when we look even to his wife, for a long time I thought Lot's wife looked back, physically looked back, and that was her sin. And through studying this more, no, yes, she probably physically did look back, but God's not going to destroy a person because she looked back. No, it was her heart that was still in Sodom. It was her desires for that lifestyle, her desires for that town. She was sad for this town that had no humanity in it. Her heart belonged back in Sodom. So while maybe she did physically look back, maybe she didn't, but she never physically took her heart out of Sodom. As she was climbing up the mountain to go into Zoar, her heart was still back there, and that's why God struck her dead, because she was just as bad as those people in Sodom. Are we fleeing? Are we choosing to linger? Are we choosing to leave our hearts back in the past? Or are we walking forward? In all honesty, I struggle with this all the time. I want to live in my worldliness a lot because it's easier. It is way easier to live in worldliness than it is to live like Abraham up in the mountains all by yourself with your family and just a few resources, outside of the world. And while we don't have to be extreme about it, we have to ask ourselves, how much are we lingering? Are we causing our own downfall by lingering in this world instead of choosing to live by the way of the Lord? Alrighty, y'all, so that was the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The next video I have will be about Lot and his daughters and the last dealings with him. So stay tuned for that. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you want. And I will see you next time. Bye.